manager at Nexus. I've worked at Nexus for 6.5 years now as staff, chartered project professional through the Association of Project Management. Before taking on this role, worked on this project for a couple of years now, so it's been, working on it for quite a bit, given that the stuff in the news has been relatively recent. I was a group project manager in the renewal section at Nexus, managing a team of project managers. Before then, I worked in a consultancy Turner and Townsend and was actually seconded into Nexus and did the work on the Central Station refurbishment, the metro station. And before that, I was down in London. I worked as a scheme project manager on the Crossrail project, the northeast spur that runs up to Shenfield. So been working in the rail industry for about 11 years now, about 10 of those as a railway PM. And as Glenn said, looking to really update you on the work that we've been doing so far on Metro to Washington. You'll know about the Leamside. There's been a lot of work done previously about reinstating the Leamside line, but it seems like this scheme has certainly got political clout and money behind it this time round. And with the announcement in June that you may have heard from the Mayor Kim McGuinness, it seems that it could go a bit further. And it's just an opportunity to tell you about the things that we're dealing with, as Glenn said, the challenges and some of the constraints that we've got, but also opportunity for Nexus as well as the region as a whole. So the risk of asking a question and have an obvious answer, what is an extension to the Tyne Weir Metro network, 13-kilometre extension, and it connects existing stations and proposes to connect existing stations between Peel and South Hilton. As I say, we've got a Mayor Kim McGuinness. The North East has been devolved since, first election was in May 2024. She's been in post. And she's recognised public transport as kind of the infrastructure of opportunity. So I suppose whatever your politics, we've got a mayor that really backs that, and we've got through devolution the powers to spend money on public transport, which is certainly a good thing for Nexus, generally considered a good thing, I think, for the region. And she's backed Metro to Washington. We've got budget, we've got money to go and produce what we call an outline business case to go and seek further funding for development. And what that outline business case is, just for me to elaborate, we've got funding to submit that outline business case in 2027. And that follows what they call Green Book government guidance, which is essentially guidance set out by the Treasury to demonstrate how a project, in this instance, a programme or a certain policy, demonstrates value for money. And that comprises a strategic case, essentially a case for change, an economic case, which, as it suggests, it demonstrates the economic side of it. In the case of this project, for every passenger that might use the metro, what does that mean for kind of the UK economy? A commercial case, how we're going to go about it, the contracts we're going to hand out, the contractors that are going to work for us, any agreements, track access agreements that we might have with Network Rail. A financial case, which states not only the capital cost of building the railway itself and ensuring the people that have to do that, but the operating costs. And obviously we want to build a railway to last, so we'll be looking at that for a long old time. So all of that needs to be put together and pulled together by the final case, which is a management case, which is essentially how it's all going to be done, the people, the processes, the systems, the governance in place, organograms all laid out in this business case to give central government and other funders the assurance that it's something worth doing. No one invests in risky infrastructure projects. We're going to demonstrate we've got a good case here. So where will Metro to Washington operate? We put that map together on our existing Tyne Weir Metro layout to aid conversations we had with the public back in June and July, just to demonstrate where it's going to go. I should say, anyone who's unfamiliar with the network, either in the room or online, the metro system comprises 2 lines. We've got a yellow line, which isn't shown on that drawing, which runs between South Shields and St James, adjacent to the football ground in Castle, via the coast, via Whitley Bay. We've got the green line, which runs from airport to South Hilton. What Metro to Washington does, in effect, is kind of close that circle. It goes from Peel to South Hilton, put the other way via Washington. but it won't necessarily operate like that. In fact, you'll know that they actually kind of changed the way the Circle Line in London worked back in 2009 because of the operational headaches of running a circular system. So it probably won't operate as an extension of the Green Line. In fact, there's at this stage a possibility it could be a new coloured line on the metro map, but it may, and this is pure speculation based on nothing, by the way, operate from, say, Sunderland right round to Monk Sutton. We don't know yet. What we do know is what we're proposing is opening up that railway between Pelham and South Hilton. 3 new stations, 1 at Follansbee, 2 in the Washington conurbation, Washington North and Washington South. Nice original names there. Follansbee's close by, the Follansbee Park, adjacent to where there used to be old mining site there. And as recently as 2001, big old Amazon depots based at Follansbee. We've got Washington North, which is close to, probably about 2 kilometres to the west of the Nissan site, close to the International Advanced Manufacturing Park. And for those that know Washington, near the Soulgrave area of Washington. And then further south on Washington South is sited the old Washington station on the Leamside line. And that's typically kind of it's got backfield to what the southwest and Teal Farm to the east. So typically more of a residential area there. And that's the old Leamside line alignment to potentially state the obvious there before it goes over the weir, over the Victoria Viaduct and takes up the old Penshaw branch alignment round South Hilton. So a little bit about these. The Leamside line, built in the 1830s, runs from Pelham and Gateshead all the way down to Ferry Hill, where it connects to the East Coast Main Line at Tearsdale. The Penshaw branch, built about 20 years later in the 1850s, connected Leamside, shown on the bottom of that drawing, with Sunderland. Obviously, the routes are no longer in operation. Reviewed by the infamous Beeching cuts and closed to timetable passenger services from the 1960s. Network Rail still owns the track there at the Leamside line. It's largely, as I say, kind of a not operational railway, with the exception of one section that people may be aware of between Pelham and Follansbee, which is still in the section of appendix. Albeit if you walk down there, there's trees growing out the track bed. So, it doesn't look like an operational railway, but it is in the sectional appendix, which, for those who may not be aware, that's a Network Rail document that's provided to operators of what is operational railway. The Penshaw branch is now a public bridleway, and Sunderland City Council actually own that land and have done since the 1980s. So besides the fact that there's a few telltale signs, one of which it's the path itself is quite flat. If you were to walk down it, you wouldn't know that a railway was once there. So a few pictures here. That's the old Cox Green station. This is kind of circa 1950s, and that's looking northeast up towards Sunderland. The old station building is part of the old station buildings there. It's still there. More on that in a bit. That's the old Washington station. I should say Usworth, which is a little bit further north on the Leamside line. That's more or less the site where we're proposing the Washington North station. But that picture would have been taken similar time, and that's looking north up towards Newcastle. And I'll talk a little bit of a lie about close-to passenger services. This would have been in the 1980s when the East Coast Main Line would have been electrified, and they diverted some of the, well, in that case, into City 125 trains, and that's running south past the Usworth Sidling box there on the Leamside upline. So a bit about Leamside South, as I said on the slide there, not to be confused with Metro of Washington, but ultimately an important part of it. Leamside South is another project looking to open up the rest of the Leamside line, so from Washington down to Ferry Hill, and looking at the reinstatement of heavy rail services. And this is being led by the North East Combined Authority. And our project, Metro of Washington, is almost seen as an enabler for that project. This is very early days, this project. It's subject to an initial engineering feasibility study, which is being conducted by AECOM. Very, very kind of high level stuff. And as I say, whilst it's it's a different project to ours. It has different, from a business point of view, it'll have different benefits. They're more sort of national kind of benefits, whereas ours focus more on the regional benefits. This is something that we can't ignore. Would be foolhardy to go and build a railway that's fit just for light rail operation that doesn't consider that there's a possibility that the rest of the Leamside line opens up to heavy rail. And this is something that kind of introduces this concept of passive provision, which we've been asked by the Combined Authority to consider. Part of our role is to kind of drill down, well, what does that actually mean? Because it makes sense, for example, to have a track bed that can carry heavy rail trains and light rail trains. But if we're surveying some bridges, some of the kind of bridges on the route, and we don't think that they're fit for heavy rail trains, but they're fit for metro trains, does that mean that that's something that we can, we could use that bridge, and that's something we don't have to do? And it's important that we get that right and not spend excessively for a scheme that, in all honesty, we don't know whether it's actually going to come off or not. Because if we spend all this money making it heavy rail ready, then it's just going to be disproportionate to the benefits that this project actually realises. But above all that, we don't want to be in a situation where, I don't know, I'm coming back to present to the PWI in 20 years' time, or I can't remember what the new name you proposed then was, whatever it will be called then. But I don't want to be in a situation where people are saying, oh, what they should have done with that project is considered this. It means they have to spend loads of money. So it's important that the two schemes interface and the two schemes are aligned. And I wanted to mention that because a lot's been made about the Leamside line reinstatement. And I think early doors, and I feel as if the project's got a bit of its own identity now, it was a bit of a risk that people didn't know what Metro of Washington was going to bring. We wouldn't want to be speaking to the people of Washington and talking about a potential freight diversion line, because that means nothing to the layman. And it's important, that with this project that we really, quite clear on the benefits that it brings. There's been plenty of infrastructure projects that have fallen by the wayside because they haven't done that. Speaking of which, why Metro to Washington? It's easy, when particularly at the stage of the project where we are, where we're starting to really get into the detail, to forget actually the strategic cases to what it's going to bring. And we've done a bit of work on developing a strategic vision, which will ultimately go into that outline business case that I spoke about. And we've kind of condensed the the benefits down into three main themes, one of which is access to opportunities, so making it easy for people in Washington, say, to get to places of education, to get to a medical appointment, and essentially looking to reduce that transport-related social exclusion, reduce deprivation. Economic growth, that's obviously the buzzword, and it's important with a strategic vision is to align with kind of national objectives. So it's all about economic growth, and we're looking to build a railway next to two massive employment site, one of which is Nissan, and as I said, the International Advanced Manufacturing Park. So if we can get other people in the region to those sites without having to get in their car, without having to sit in traffic on the A19 or the Western Bypass, then that's going to show up well in our business case. And then the final one is sustainability and resilience. And we kind of twin these two together because, of course, you can get like a climate change resilience, obviously kind of an electrified system. That's, a good way to travel as opposed to people getting in their cars. So having something climate resilient, but also having a resilient means of travel. Having two connections into Sunderland city centre is better than one, and it makes the transport system itself more resilient. Program then, this was something when we spoke to members of the public in June and July, they were keen to know. They balked at the timescales, mind, but hopefully I can describe the kind of the method and the madness as to why it's going to be beyond 2030 that this scheme's going to be completed. The first stage is that OBC, and really a business case. If we're developing a business case, it sort of undersells our outputs, what we're doing at this stage. When there was an announcement last summer, Tankin McGinnis, we're going to give 8 million to develop for Nexus to develop an OBC. A lot of people, particularly connected with the Northumberland line, were going 8 million for a business case. Like, plumbing heck, what are you going to spend on the actual project? But in reality, we're doing a lot more than just producing a business case. Concurrently, we're starting off our design development. We're at a feasibility stage. And with the money that we've got for a business case, we're going to then move on to more intrusive surveys, and then ultimately with that budget produce outline designs for the whole scheme. So as I say, we're kind of in the detail now. And then alongside that, it isn't just the engineering progression. We're developing a land and consent strategy. I'll talk about it a little bit more, but there's a lot to that. And that takes a lot of planning from the outset. So spending some of that time and money at this stage on that, we envisage is gonna pay dividends, particularly with the engineering element, because, well, for two reasons. If you've got costs and other information or business case which is based on, nigh on a design and principle, then you're reducing your risk. You've learned more about the scheme and you can have more confidence in the numbers. The second thing is, after that announcement in June, when political figures like Kim McGuinness would say Metro to Washington is going to happen, mayors obviously are elected on terms, so we're acutely aware that there may be a need to move quick, and it's good to get this work done up front. So once we presented that OBC, and we hope to do that, as I say, in 2027, we move on to the second phase. And in the second phase, in between outline business case and final business case, usually this is the bit where you get your procurement ducks in a row. You kind of get your contract proposals all lined up, so when you do get that final funding, you can award the contract and off you go. But something else that's driving the timescales here is the consent to go and build the railway. I'll cover that off in a bit, but essentially, in the way that it's looking, we're going to have to go and get a Transport and Works Act order to go and build this job and operate the job. And then finally, put there 2030 onwards is award those contracts, detailed design, and then go and build it. And I put fleet delivery. We're going to be extending the metro network. We're going to need more trains. So there's almost like another mini project there in procuring more trains to enable this extension to the metro. So the design development, as I say, this is something that we hope will really enhance our business case. So the more we know about where we're planning to build Metro to Washington, that helps have a lot more confidence in the numbers and what we're stating in the OBC, providing that compelling case. Early this year, back in January time, we ordered a 5-year contract to Arup, and I suppose it works in a bit like a framework. It's a single supplier framework, if there is such a thing. It's made up of a number of different call-off contracts. And what I'm trying to show there is the fact that we've started off with relatively little. We've stipulated our requirements, and at each stage, we progressively learn more and more. So we're in that light blue zone there, the feasibility study. That's where we are now. In fact, just today, we've undertaken some of the IDCs, interdisciplinary design checks with the feasibility. I'm surprised there's people who are at those IDCs who had enough energy to come out today to be there. So well done, those people. And then we'll move on to design and principle. So each stage we're learning more about the job, and each call off becomes a little bit more. We've got a bit more knowledge of the job, so we can then supply the contractor at Arup in this case with that information. And we thought it was best to have that long-term partnership with one supplier, because particularly from the outset, they start to gather all the knowledge, and to go out and have some other framework where there was multiple suppliers would mean there was a risk that we'd lose that knowledge. And there's an investment in both parties. It's a partnership, as I say. We'll work together on it. And then potentially, depending on timings, we may include detailed design as part of that framework arrangement. It may be something that we procure when we get the final funding. And I mentioned the IDCs. That's a picture of those of us who are involved in the initial options workshop. So we've been speaking about potential alignment, where the stations are going to be. And the PWI will be happy that a couple of their members, there's Sean and Glenn in that photo. So the PWI is well represented there in the decision making on Metro Washington. So some of the technical challenges that we've been discussing on that framework, and as we move through the options development. First off is Pelo Junction, right there, kind of the where the Metro of Washington connects into the existing network. And this certainly isn't an exhaustive list. And there's the reds are just my annotations and things to consider, just to provide a bit more context to that line diagram. So really, how do you connect in? What are our options? Well, with passive provision and the fact that certainly between Pelaw and Follinsby, that section still is in the section appendix, to kind of sever the Leamside line completely from the LN3, the Durham coastline, is something that we're not considering. Then you've also got to consider, well, any work that you do, is it going to take place in the existing rail corridor, or are you going to bring out any kind of new metro lines outside the existing rail corridor? Each have their pros and cons. It's less messy from a signalling point of view if you bring it outside the existing railway corridor, but it means that you've got, a land acquisition problem, and you're essentially, also purchasing land. You're dealing with topography that might not be as straightforward in the existing railway alignment. And then you've got the interaction within the existing railway alignment. As I say, it's a bit of a signalling problem. And not only are you kind of at the mercy of timetabling on the LE3, but there's this issue that we don't know yet, is we're kind of second guessing to a certain extent what this lean side south may require. And it may well be that when that scheme comes along, if it does come along, that the whole junction is remodeled anyway. So there's some decision making to do, and I sense there's not going to be a perfect solution. There'll be something put there with the constraints and what it might mean in terms of cost. I point to the fact that there's this Network Rail REBs, which are relocatable equipment buildings in that area there. So whilst they themselves could remain in situ, the problem we've got is kind of Network Rail's access to those buildings may mean that has to be some sort of crossing. Do we have to kind of go over that access road? Can we go over that grade? These are all things to consider. I mean, the fact that they're in the name and they're called relocatable equipment buildings, you would think an option is just to move the damn things, but this is stuff we're going to shake out with Network Rail. The Victoria Viaduct, built in the 1830s, obviously coincided with the construction of the Leamside line. If you know your Hanoverian history, that was the decade that Queen Victoria was crowned, hence the name. It's a Grade 2 star listed structure, which certainly is a consideration, because if you look at that picture there on the right hand side, you can squeeze 2 tracks in there. There was 2 tracks in there, but what does that mean in terms of walkway requirements, and if a train was to stop on the viaduct and pedestrian access and this, that and the other? So it's all those things need to be considered. If we're to have walkways, where they're going to go, what will that mean in terms of the listed states? There's also a question over its structural integrity. We think it's fine to carry 2 metro trains. Certainly the literature that we've had from Network Rail seems to imply that's the case. We will need to quite literally dig down into that detail and undertake some intrusive surveys ourselves. But again, you probably wouldn't want to consider one single track on there from the outset. From an operational point of view, it doesn't look palatable. And to be honest, this section of the route has many challenges. So I've summarised them here, and this really isn't an exhaustive list. Not only I should have said the whole route is obviously at risk from some of the old mine works in the area. I mean, we know today, James was just saying in the IBC that some of the bridges were replaced and due to some of the subsides in the area. But starting from left all the way to, or starting from the west where they connect the 2 alignments, the first challenge is that we're going from Network Rail land to Sunderland City Council land, which we can consider 2 of our partners in this project, but in order to join the 2, we're going through third-party lines. So there's a kind of a compulsory purchase or land acquisition question there. There's also 2 different levels to go from, and if you're familiar with the area where the Victoria Viaduct ends down to this Penshire Branch public right-of-way section. So a particular option is a specific option is a big old kind of viaduct to take it down to that level to join the former alignment. I mentioned Cox Green Station before. Part of the buildings are still there, and the where the old railway was kind of goes through right in the, it's someone's land now. So in order to use that section of alignment, then that land would need to be purchased. I should say there's several kind of low-level crossings as well that we need to consider. Even if we were to move the alignment, and this is something kind of ironically that we're considering, you look at former railway alignments and they're good bets for reinstatement because you think it's relatively low risk to build a railway where there was one. But ironically, we're looking at options of moving the line to avoid some of these kind of hazards, I guess, or things to consider. Then you've got, as an example, playing fields to the east of the A19. The A19 in itself, that's the underpass there, the public bridleway, wide enough to fit two tracks underneath. No, that need to be extended. Again, it's doable. You can keep the A19 open, but that's road closures on the A19. So these are big old decisions, and certainly for this section of the route, there isn't going to be an ideal one. And then finally, I mentioned crossings, but this is the one that leaves kind of we're scratching our heads over this one. This is Hilton Bank. This is looking kind of north on Hilton Bank. So as you look at that photograph, on the right-hand side is South Hilton, where our service terminates. On the left-hand side is the kind of the end of that public bridleway where the Pinkstone branch once was. So you're heading down the bank into South Hilton Village, and that's the only way into South Hilton Village. So what are your options? The options is put level crossing. That's the only way into South Hilton Village. So you're increasing not only traffic congestion in the area. That's a question for emergency services. And whilst I think we spoke about this the last time I was at a PWI meeting, is that the need for level crossing certainly can be challenged. If you've got a good case and the cost is disproportionate otherwise, from an operational point of view, let alone the kind of safety risks, it's not something ideally that we would want. So then you're looking at very expensive options. You're looking at closing maybe closing that road and diverting that road. And some of the diversions that we're considering, and this will take you quite a way around South Hilton. And then there's an expensive option of potentially a cutting. You can't take the railway over the road. Well, at least I sort of don't think so, because obviously railways don't work particularly well on severe gradients. So the best option in terms of whether it's over or under is to introduce a cutting, because you're at a relatively low level coming from the west, that it is achievable. But all of this needs to be shaken out, and options need to be kind of considered further. We've got to work out the land and consent strategy. So most projects at Nexus deliver on our own infrastructure. Most railway projects delivered on their own infrastructure. We're in a privileged position, through railways kind of legislation that through the Town and Country Planning Act, actually, that we have, if we're able to do this, we're going to permitted development. So there's that we don't have, because we're proposing to develop land that isn't ours, where there isn't a railway. And also the fact that, we don't even own the land. Here I am speaking from Nexus, and I'm talking about what I'm proposing to do on Network Rail land, Sunderland City Council land, and probably some other people's land as well. So, for a long time, railway projects went to seek kind of authorization through an act of Parliament pre-1992. And obviously in 1992, parliamentarians obviously got sick of debating these local issues and new railways, so they introduced the Transport and Work Act. And that's a way in which you can apply for consent to go and build and operate not only railways, but other transport-related infrastructure. And this consent, it doesn't provide planning permission per se, but as part of the order, the Transport and Works Act order, you ask the Secretary of State to kind of recommend planning permission. So it kind of respects the fact that we have that planning legislation. Similarly, compulsory purchase, there's a route through the Transport and Works Act order where we will be able to acquire the land that we're seeking for this project. Compulsory purchase is a bit of a derogatory term. It's almost like, it's and quite rightly so, I guess. It's from a time when I suppose you'd have some sort of authority wants to go and build a railway in the Victorian times, and would just do so in the interest of the public good, with no respect for maybe what the private loss is. And I suppose nowadays there's provisions in place, not least through this Transport and Works Act order, where the Secretary of State needs to balance kind of the public good versus the private loss. And in all honesty, most of the time you don't actually get that far. Most of the time there's kind of a relatively friendly kind of agreement made to purchase land, and it doesn't actually go through as a CPO'd transaction, if you like. This Transport and Works Act comprises of a number of things. I've written their book of reference, which is essentially, you can imagine kind of a terrier map of the land with a red line boundary of the land that we'll need to go and build this railway. Obviously, it's not just the track bed. Despite the fact that you're the PWI, the Permanent Way Institution, a railway is a lot more than that. It's where your stations are going to be, car parks, provision for other things, other kind of access to services. But also you've got your construction arrangements. What land would be nice to have a construction compound, and how you're going to get there, access roads. So all these things need to be considered. So despite the fact that when we're pulling this together, which will be more or less around the time that we submit that OBC, just after, we're thinking about those kind of construction arrangements early doors. Consultation report is an important document, which is essentially kind of a back catalogue of all the kind of consultation we've done on the scheme. It's demonstration that not only have we gone out and spoken to people, but it's all been factored into the proposal. And it started right from the very start. So as I say, we undertook some public engagement back in June and July. We didn't really have a load to consult on, but the feedback that we'll get from that is stuff that we'll be able to determine kind of our decision making. And we can document that as part of the consultation report. And that's the start of producing a compelling case for the Secretary of State. And finally, environmental statement. So it doesn't, as I say, it's environmental statement for a big kind of development is a prerequisite, and it's important to note that this TWAO doesn't bypass those planning requirements. It's important that we demonstrate that there isn't going to be an adverse impact on the environment. There's lots of different aspects here, from a visual impact to air quality, groundwater. So those things are considered assessed, and if there are significant impacts, we look to mitigate those. As I say, I think it is this kind of draconian perception of the railways that you kind of bulldoze through everything, and there's obviously a lot to get through before you can do that. And I suppose HS2 is testament to that. Timescales for all of this is circa 24 months. That's with the public inquiry, which, given the size and the significance of this scheme, I don't mean significance in terms of magnitude. Well, in magnitude, not in terms of actual kind of physical size, but the importance, regional importance. We suspect that it's almost inevitable that this is going to go to public inquiry. Quick word. I feel like I've bored your socks off with kind of regulation, but an alternative would be a development consent order, and that's a relatively new thing for the Planning Act 2008, whereby it's deemed to be nationally significant infrastructure project. You can apply for a DCO. There's not a great deal of difference, albeit there's stipulated timescales. But the way we think the moment, it's looking like a TWAO, because depending on what Metro of Washington looks like, this isn't going to be a change to the heavy rail network. We're going to be introducing a railway that just Metro trains are going to be operating on, and Nexus as the scheme promoter. Well, in rail terms, we're not Network Rail. We don't operate a national railway. Speaking of which, working with Network Rail, kind of any way you look at it, Network Rail have got some skin in the game in this. See, I mentioned they own the sideline track bed. For those of you who don't know, they actually operate our trains around the coast via Sunderland, all the way up to the South Hilton, even though the stretch between Sunderland and South Hilton doesn't include any of the rolling stock apart from ours. And of course, this whole passive provision and the fact that they rail trains and certain aspects of the sideline in the future means that Network Rail is a conversation. I put this slide again to demonstrate what the options that we've got. It could just be a Nexus scheme where you have go to a light rail standard, it's not and goes designs and builds it, and then we include passive provision. Or it could be on the other end of the spectrum, it could just be a network rail scheme built to heavy rail standard, everything, not just the track, bridges, clearances, whatever it might be. Network rail owned and operated. They go and promote and consent it. Interestingly, they've never actually submitted a DCO. It's always been another company like an East West Rail or kind of a local authority that's gone and got that consent on their behalf. A network rail design and build it, and then it's lean side south ready. It's not passive provision because ultimately, it's built for the heavy rail network anyway. But in reality, kind of those two options aren't actually feasible. I mean, it's almost a bit of a paradox where you're building to a light rail standard and including for passive provision. You can't really do that. And whilst I've got three options there's multiple options in that middle one in that hybrid scheme. And really where we are at the moment with network rail is almost we're having discussions as part of kind of an overarching agreement to determine what it looks like to cherry pick, okay, again, as an example, network rail continue to own the track layer, the lean sideline, but maybe, Nexus have a long-term lease and we hand back that infrastructure if lean side south comes along. I'm not saying that, doesn't throw up issues, handing over infrastructure to network rail, a signaling system to network rail. It's a conversation that we need to have with their ops team rather than just some of the sponsorship team that we're liaising with now. But whatever it is, we need to kind of thrash out the mechanisms for, every single eventuality. And as I say, if we can at least agree provisionally some sort of overarching agreement between us and network rail as part of our OBC, again, that demonstrates that the scheme's a little bit more believable and, we've thought about it. Public engagement, I mentioned that we went out in June and July, and coincidentally, we were planning this sort of engagement. And then, to the surprise of a lot of people, Rachel Reed comes out and says, I'm giving the Northeast 1.85 billion spend on transport infrastructure projects. Some of that's going to be to take the Metro to Washington. So that came as a surprise to some of us at Nexus anyway. And coincidentally, we'd arranged these public engagement sessions, within a couple of weeks of that announcement. So I suppose to the person on the street, it looks like we really had our ducks in a row and we were ready for this announcement. But the problem was that when we spoke to the public, I think they were expecting to see something else rather than, the likes of me rambling on about what Metro to Washington could look like. But in reality, joking aside, those sessions were really good to hear what people thought, hear about local issues as well, which we can factor in, to the Lincolns, as I mentioned, that consultation report and really drive decision making. So we actually had a session internally this week just to discuss actions off the back of what we learned from those sessions. And we'll plan more events, once we've kind of completed all the developments, perhaps, just prior to the OBC submission or just after, you can go out and we can demonstrate, how we factored in those comments and update people on how it's been developed. And as I was saying to those people, those public engagement sessions, I'd encourage everyone to go and have a look at the Metro to Washington website. It's part of the Nexus website. There's a QR code there which will direct you to it. And it includes information which will be updated as the scheme progresses, but there's an opportunity to sign up to a mailing list. Something that we need to get around to is developing kind of whether it's a quarterly newsletter or something issued at certain intervals, to keep people, members of the public, up to date with the scheme. But there's also a questionnaire on there just to hear people's thoughts about the scheme. Not only kind of whether they think it's a good idea or a bad idea, or whether it affects them, the construction that would affect them, but whether they would use it, and if they would, where would they, commute or travel to and from, and all that data, can be used in loads of ways. So it's so important to us. And I remember I came to PWI for a session on the Borders Railway, and Peter Hubeck spoke, and I made a lot of notes that day. You could probably understand why. Delivering this scheme, but also I was asked by Glenn last minute to do the word of thanks. So I was scribbling loads of notes down on his presentation. So I've got them, and I looked at them before I gave, was planning this presentation. And one of it was about getting the people on side. And the Borders Railway, I think, really had that to their credit. The public really wanted it. And in an age where there's a lot of cynicism with infrastructure projects, based on some kind of famous or infamous examples, and the money, particularly at this time when people aren't feeling particularly rich, the money that they cost, it's so important to try and put over the benefits and listen to the people that ultimately, we're looking to provide a service for. It's got to work for the people of Washington if we're taking the Metro to Washington. So that's why we're really, really keen on hearing what they have to say. Any questions?
Well, thanks very much for that, John. We'll do questions from the room first, and then from the chat. So over to you guys.
James?
This will be a tough one.
Right.
So I think it's about like the sort of development consent order versus Transport Works Act order. Precedent examples from Network Rail that I've seen is some projects, sort of like Trans-Pennine Route Upgrade, Northumberland Line, they kind of proceed with elements of the scheme that are like no regret elements, using the powers that they have, like permitted development and development consent, while they're waiting for the Transport Works Act order to be granted for bits that aren't on current operational railway land. And I was just wondering, like, is that a potential option for this scheme, that the bits that are on network rail land, i.e. it's not an operational rail, but it's still railway land. Is that something that like certain aspects of the scheme can begin, or a Transport Works Act order it's in progress? But like, because that's, I don't know the difference in time scales. Is that something? I know that's happened on like Transport. We've done a lot of upgrade works that are no regrets aspects of the scheme, like things that almost definitely happen. So, yeah,
Absolutely, it's an option. And I think with the two schemes that you mentioned, there's that kind of political willpower to get stuff done. And I'm not saying I don't want the project to go fast if we're not kind of incentivized to, but as you know, I guess we're at the stage where we're on that front, the kind of the planning consents, we're almost like assessing our options. And once we're in that position, the kind of honing down on the design, that's probably when we'll be able to kind of lock in on those sort of things and move quick. We'll have a better idea of opportunities to do something. Sean?
Just wondering, basically, is there been any lessons learned from the way Sunderland Direct was managed? It was the transition from rail track at the time, which then eventually became part of Network Rail. It's basically, I used to look after Sunderland Direct, it was almost like class a bit of a disjoint. The responsibilities of it.
Yeah.
And my concern is basically if you do it in the hybrid, there's not clear responsibilities who's supposed to do what. How would then manage it going forward, So it was up to like heavy freight.
Yeah, it's absolutely a risk. I like to think we've got people that we're working with at Network Rail, we've got contacts on the kind of the sponsorship, property and the ASPRO side of things. And we're having these kind of conversations early. But I guess where you've got two different systems potentially meeting, you're always introducing that risk. But I don't think there's any way of looking at it where we're not going to be introducing. If Metro to Washington is going to be, operating Metro cars, then we can't avoid that risk. And I guess we've got to, there's going to be, in the case of a signal fringe, that's got to sit somewhere. But I think this is what we really need to drill down, as I say, when we're developing that overarching agreement between Network Rail and Nexus. We've got to look at our options, speak about it, workshop it internally, and then go to Network Rail with our proposal. And I think, I don't know, but Sunderland Direct, from what I've heard from people who were working for Nexus at the time, was very much kind of a Nexus incentivized and kind of like, wanting to move Network Rail along, and it's in a way, there's similarities in the way that there isn't, because, you know, just for example, that section of track between Sunderland and South Hilton, you know, it made sense for Network Rail to operate that because it would introduce that little bit of track where, you know, Tyneside signalling room would have handed over to our control room just to take a train down to South Hilton. So there's little nuances like that we might actually be able to iron out, opportunities to kind of iron out some of those things that were kind of leftovers from Sunderland Direct.
No,
But I thought,
I'm just thinking the time scales, because at the moment we're trying to relocate some kit, and that's got a time scale of probably about 18 months.
Mhm.
So, you know, if you're tying into like get your applications put in and stuff like that.
I think the difference here is that we're not, if it's part of I mean, I'm not kind of putting it all down to the Transport and Works Act order, but if it's all part of a bigger kind of project and there's funding handed over from central government, yes, maybe there's a little bit more clout than fixing some things that were potentially leftovers from Sunderland Direct. I don't know, but yes, to answer your question, there's absolutely lessons to be learned, and I'd happily have a chat with you if there's any other personal lessons on.
Well, was a station at Cox Green or Penshaw considered? Or is it future provision for it?
It's a really good question. I think the more and more people I speak to about the station at Penshaw, the more kind of person. It's just my own personal opinion. So it makes sense. You know, it's on the line with the old room side. There's a lot of residential areas around it. There's potential for new development around it. But I suppose I should have mentioned that what we inherited was a strategic outline business case, which stipulated stations at Follinsby, Washington North and Washington South. So our kind of brief from the combined authority at the moment is to focus on stations in those areas. It is something that, you know, we are kind of considering. It's not to say that it would be part of the scope, but we are kind of, you know, looking at alignments, you know, potential for the stations at Penshaw, but that's not formally part of the Metro Washington scope at the moment. I think only an argument can be made to change that scope. So as I say, it's not being considered in the ODC.
At Penshaw, they're building new houses,
Yeah,
a lot of new houses.
that's right. Yes.
But the thing that I noticed, they commented on the Victoria Viaduct, that it'd be strong enough.
Yeah.
Used to take 2 37s and 3 torpedo I-0 wagons across. In the past.
So no need to do no structural investigations then like this.
Photographs.
Question online
Yeah.
relevant to viaducts as well. Is there any trade-off between running in and out lines over the viaducts and having heavy rail passive provision and it being a single track section as we go and pinch point the timetable? So I guess it's just highlighting that key constraint of singling that section versus timetable implications.
Yeah, I
I've used a
suppose.
viaduct inspection unit on a single line in the Friddlehead. Saved thousands, wasted millions.
I think with the it's almost like that the option for a single line across the viaduct in the context of passive provision. I mean, you know, in my mind, and I suppose I'm not establishing the appetite from it from a heavy rail network, but if you've got both metros, freight trains, potentially heavy rail passenger trains, all wanting to pass over that viaduct with a single line, I don't know, need I say more? I just don't think that's kind of doable. Perhaps single line for the metro, but to answer that passive provision question, I don't think.
Just mentioned the F word, right? In my younger days, in a freeway design office in York, immediately south of Busworth signal box, I designed a complete new junction to access the Nissan plant, so that cars could come out by rail. On the opposite side was rail access to MI King, which is the company that takes steel coil and makes it into bonnets, boots, wings, bodywork for Nissan. So those drawings, those designs for that freight facility will be on record at Network Rail, and I'll have anybody who'd like to do.
There have been, you know, when we've obviously look to develop in this area, there's obviously been conversations about a freight line to network rail, whether those drawings, they're referring to your drawings or not, isn't really a question. I suppose the way I'd answer that question isn't going to be in an enlightening way. I suppose we're focused on providing kind of provision for
I think at the time, although Nissan were enthusiastic, they cooled with the closure of the impending closure of the Leam sideline.
Yeah.
Now, with the reopening of the Leam sideline, will Nissan warm up a little bit more?
potentially with a heavy rail link. But I mean, I guess, I don't know, up at time dock, they might be a bit perturbed with that decision, you know, so that there needs to be, I guess, it relates back to this kind of strategic view. There needs to be a question asked, is that the right thing for the northeast, you know, all things considered?
Well, it is when there's bits of lorries taking cars down to the docks,
True.
like a
Yeah.
conveyor belt system, you know, 24/7.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's all designed and it's all responsibility.
But it's one thing to bear in mind that the, you know, also it's not really in our scope of the Nissan and the Nissan link. But if you were to want, if you did want trains running northwards from Nissan to get to Tyne Dock, you would have to build a second connection as well, before you can get up to Pilo, another curve on what used to be the wagon way, the Gerald wagon way, to curve back round onto the Sunderland line to get into the Tyne Dock, the Bolden West curve. So that would be another bit of railway infrastructure there.
Well, the plan was the design incorporates run round sidings at Busworth, and he would come into the goods loop at Pilo and then head down towards Sunderland.
Is that feasible with the curves? Yeah, with the fact that some people now we're calling the Jarrow oil.
Yeah.
I think we're starting to get into detail. We'll go to the next question if that's all right, because I'm conscious of time.
Question online that connects with the question I had. Is there consideration for the long-term maintenance benefits of being able to accommodate heavy rail on the network? And I guess more specifically for me, when we look at the challenges of midweek renewal, midweek work generally on that two-track section on the East Coast Main Line, I think there are potentially business case opportunities that we don't currently have via the coast because of the signalling headways and the challenges of being able to dive the capacity issues around the coast that this could open up. So there may be a component of the business case which is network rail then rather than again we're probably touching more on the
it's this is why it's not necessarily network rail led, but that's why we need that kind of network rail input to kind of consider those things that perhaps Nexus as a promoter of this scheme wouldn't otherwise consider. I mean, I do think we've got an informed group of people at Nexus who are informed client with respect to railways, but this project has a large kind of stakeholder community, so we do need to tap into that, and those are the sort of opportunities that we do need to make sure we consider, because, and I talk about this kind of passive provision. We're not looking as part of this scheme, and mince the words, to roll out the red carpet for heavy rail. We just don't want to do anything that would mean a lot of money has to be spent in order to kind of rectify it. Let's say, notwithstanding your point about the loading on the Victoria Viaduct, but let's say that heavy rail trains couldn't run over the Victoria Viaduct. Then I suppose that's up to a heavy rail scheme that seeks to open up the Leam sideline to heavy rail traffic to build a new crossing of the River Wear. I guess that's one argument. But at this stage, where we are is it's quite literally plotting out those constraints down the routes and kind of flagging them up. And this feasibility report that we'll put together with Aaron will highlight that. And then there's this decision point before we go through that project gate to say, well, look, what's this scheme going to look like now?
Any more questions? Any more from the room?
We just see a British Rail here when it was singled over Victoria Viaduct, they put it in the middle, so they couldn't use the viaduct for inspection when it's all had to be slowed. they also made another mistake on the single lines. They put 25-mile-an-hour leads into the single line section, so that slowed everything down because it was a faster speed over the viaduct and around the curves and everything had to slow down. So the occupancy took longer going over the viaduct. So those mistakes will not want to be repeated.
Yeah, I think we had the same at Ribblehead, and you know the cost of scaffolding to do routine site inspections at Ribblehead was outrageous. There was no other way to do it.
Presume the overhead line to Washington will be 1500 volts DC, which is what I'm listening. Will there be any problem with network railing for that?
I thought I got away with our whole presentation. And after I thought about electrification, you've got my Achilles heel there. But no, that with passive provision, that's a massive question. We're talking about it today because what we haven't thought about is potentially metro trains running off battery. The standard trains that we've got are what we call a day 2 battery provision, which needs to be sort of tested, all things considered. It could probably at this stage wouldn't be able to go all the way around that 30 kilometers with enough kind of contingency if there was any sort of issues. But if you might, let's say, electrify part of the route to allow the trains to have enough charge to make it all the way around before they get back under the early, it's a long. But there are systems that allow for that type of pass provision. The super tram in Sheffield, where there's mixed use kind of fleet there, trams and heavy rail trains allow for, well, they were upgraded to allow for heavy rail use. So there are options there, but that's something that's it's very much subject to the feasibility work that we're doing now. But it's a good point. I mean, it would be to answer your question directly, though, to have 1.5 kV up and down the lean side line. It wouldn't offer passive provision because we're taking down all the overhead line to replace it potentially with provision for the heavy rail trains. So whatever we go with, it's probably going to be quite a novel idea. A pretty good question. Thanks.
Thank you. Okay, silence. Thank you very much for your questions from the room and online. So there are no more questions. I'm going to ask Phil Kirkland to give a vote. Thanks.
Thanks, Phil. Thanks, John. Thanks, first of all, for your time tonight, giving up your time to come and talk to us. It's always appreciated. If you didn't know about Metro to Washington, you certainly do now, and it's a daunting prospect. You've got your work cut out, but it's exciting, and it's certainly probably one of the, if not the biggest rail project in the Northeast for many, many years. I think in terms of Nexus, the airport extension would be something that we would compare it with, but without the network rail element. And, lining up all these dominoes and all these permutations of who it's going to satisfy and what it's going to do and what the outputs are, you can see, all the work that goes on behind the scenes to actually get to that first lane track in the ground. An unenviable task. And I think the reason South Hilton stayed with Network Rail was the timescale and cost of changing the parliamentary documentation that related to the route. It's not a case of just signing over a piece of paper. And I think in many of these cases, that's why it stays the same. So thanks for a fabulous talk. I do hope you'll come back and talk to us maybe in a year's time to see where we've got to.
Talk about
if we're still progressing. But I'll leave you with a fun fact today. We've got the checkered flag for the Metro in 1978, and the first public service train ran in 1980. Those textiles. Yeah. I'll just leave that with you. Good point.
Thanks very much for that, Phil. Thanks, John. thanks for everybody in the room and online. So, last item, our October meeting will be hybrid again at Central Room 21, where we are today. The 7th of October, and we've got James Barlow going to give a presentation on the Worth Valley Railway Bridge Works. There we are. So, nice, interesting one for those who are interested in bridges. Yes. So, thank you very much again, and I'll close the meeting. Anything, Matt? Thanks very much for getting all that sorted out.
I'm not from the